What if I told you that everything you think you know about heroes, gods, and epic stories comes from tales that are over 3,000 years old? What if the gods of ancient Greece were more twisted, more human, and more terrifying than any modern horror movie? And what if, by the end of this journey, you'll understand why these stories still control how we think about power, love, and destiny? Prepare yourself for the complete story of Greek mythology, from the violent birth of the universe to the bloody fall of Troy. In the beginning, there was only chaos. Not darkness, not emptiness, but something far more terrifying. Pure, absolute nothingness, where even the concept of existence had no meaning. But from this void emerged the first forces of reality. Gaia, the earth herself, breathing and alive. Eros, not a cute cherub, but the raw power of attraction that binds all things. And Erebus, darkness so deep it could swallow light itself. Gaia, alone in the infinite emptiness, gave birth to Uranus, the starry sky. They became the first couple in existence, and from their union came the Titans, beings of unimaginable power who controlled the fundamental forces of nature. But here's where the story gets dark. Uranus was a monster of a father. He was so terrified of his children's power that the moment each Titan was born, he shoved them back into Gaia's womb, imprisoning them in the depths of the earth. Picture this cosmic horror. Gaia carrying these giant divine beings inside her, feeling them struggle and suffer in eternal darkness. The pain drove her to desperate measures. She forged a weapon from the hardest material in existence and gave it to her youngest son, Kronos. The plan was simple but brutal. When Uranus next came to embrace her, Kronos would strike. And strike he did. In the first act of violence the universe had ever seen, Kronos castrated his father with one savage blow. Uranus's scream of agony cracked the foundations of reality itself. But from this horrific act came something beautiful. Where the severed flesh fell into the sea, it created foam. And from this foam emerged Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. Think about that for a moment. Love and beauty, born from the most brutal act of violence imaginable. This paradox would define everything about Greek mythology. Beauty and horror, creation and destruction, love and hate, all twisted together in ways that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature. As Uranus bled out across the heavens, he cursed his son with his dying breath. But Kronos had won the ultimate prize. He ruled the universe now. Except the curse haunted him. When he married his sister Rhea and she became pregnant, paranoia consumed his mind. What if one of his children really would overthrow him? There was only one solution he could think of, and it was monstrous. The moment his first child, Hestia, was born, Kronos grabbed the infant and swallowed her whole. When Rhea screamed in horror, he explained coldly that this was necessary to protect his rule. Then Demeter was born, and he swallowed her too. Then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon. 5 children devoured by their own father. By the time Rhea was pregnant with her 6th child, she was broken by grief, but determined to save at least one baby. She traveled to a hidden cave on Crete and gave birth to Zeus in secret. Then she wrapped a stone in baby clothes and presented it to Kronos as their newborn son. In his madness and hunger, he swallowed the stone without even looking. Zeus grew up in hiding, raised by nymphs and fed by a magical goat, and when he reached manhood, he had a plan for revenge that was as clever as it was satisfying. He disguised himself as a cupbearer and gave his father a potion that would make him vomit up everything he had ever swallowed. Picture this scene: Kronos drinking the potion, then his stomach beginning to heave violently. First came the stone, then one by one Zeus's siblings emerged, fully grown and ready for war. 5 adult gods stepping out of their father's stomach, their divine power intact, but their rage burning like cosmic fire. This sparked the Titanomachy, a 10-year war that nearly destroyed the universe. This wasn't just a battle between armies. This was reality itself tearing apart as the forces of the old world clashed with the new. Mountains were hurled like rocks. Oceans boiled away to nothing. The earth split open, revealing the burning depths below. Zeus proved he was more than just powerful. He was smart. While the Titans had raw force, Zeus had strategy. He freed the Cyclops from their underground prison, and in gratitude they forged him the most devastating weapon ever created, the Thunderbolt. He also freed the 100-handed giants, creatures so terrifying that they could hurl boulders the size of mountains. When the war finally ended, Zeus had won completely. The defeated Titans were cast into Tartarus, a pit so deep and horrible that it made hell look pleasant. Atlas, who had led the Titan armies, received a special punishment. He was condemned to hold up the sky for all eternity, bearing the weight of the heavens on his shoulders every second of every day. But now Zeus faced a new problem. The world was beautiful but empty of intelligent life. There were animals and plants, but no beings capable of worship, art, or the complex thoughts that made existence interesting. This is where humans enter the story, though not in the way you might expect. Prometheus, one of the few Titans who had sided with Zeus, looked at the earth and saw only beasts living in caves. He decided to create something better. Using clay and water, he sculpted the first humans in the image of the gods. But they lived like animals, afraid of the dark, eating raw meat, huddling together for warmth. Prometheus's heart broke watching his creations struggle. They had such potential, but they lacked the one thing that could transform them from clever animals into something approaching the divine. Fire, the sacred flame of the gods that represented knowledge, technology, civilization itself. Zeus had strictly forbidden anyone from giving fire to humans, but Prometheus couldn't watch his children suffer in ignorance. He climbed Mount Olympus and stole a burning coal from the hearth of the gods, carrying it down to earth in a hollow reed. The transformation was immediate and miraculous. With fire, humans could cook their food, forge tools, light the darkness. They could work metal, build houses, create art. Fire was the foundation of everything we call civilization. Zeus was absolutely furious when he discovered the theft. These humans were now capable of challenging the gods themselves. His punishment for Prometheus was designed to be the ultimate torture. He chained the Titan to a mountain peak where every day a giant eagle would come to devour his liver. Every night, because Prometheus was immortal, the liver would grow back. Every morning, the eagle would return to feast again. This wasn't just physical agony. Prometheus could see the future, which meant he knew this torture would continue for 30,000 years. Every single day for 30,000 years, the same horrific pain, with no hope of relief. But Zeus wasn't finished with his revenge. He wanted to punish humanity for accepting the stolen fire. So he commanded Hephaestus to create the first woman. Each god contributed something to her creation. Aphrodite gave her beauty. Athena taught her crafts. Hermes gave her the ability to lie. And Zeus gave her curiosity, an insatiable desire to know things that were forbidden. Her name was Pandora, meaning all gifts. Zeus also gave her a sealed jar with one simple instruction: never open it under any circumstances. Then he sent her to Earth to marry Epimetheus, Prometheus's brother. You know what happened next. Driven by the curiosity Zeus had planted in her, Pandora eventually opened the jar. Out poured every evil that would plague humanity for the rest of time. Disease and old age, war and famine, hatred and despair, all escaping into the world like a dark cloud of misery. By the time she managed to close the lid, only one thing remained inside: hope. This was Zeus's cruelest joke. With hope, humans would endure any suffering, always believing things might get better. They would cling to life through any hardship, because hope whispered that tomorrow might be different. And so ended the Golden Age, when humans lived without care or worry, never growing old, never knowing pain. Now they would experience the full range of human suffering.
But they would also discover something Zeus hadn't expected. Suffering often creates greatness. The humans who emerged from Pandora's catastrophe weren't innocent anymore, but they were stronger, wiser, more creative, and more dangerous. Zeus thought he had won, but he hadn't counted on his own weaknesses. Despite being married to Hera, he couldn't stop having affairs with mortal women. And from these unions came the heroes, beings with divine blood in their veins, who would reshape the world. But this is where our story takes an even darker turn, because Hera, queen of the gods and goddess of marriage, had finally had enough of her husband's infidelity, and her revenge would create the greatest hero of all time, while simultaneously ensuring his life would be a living nightmare. The hero's name was Heracles, and his story began with Zeus's deception. The king of the gods disguised himself as a mortal woman's husband, while the real husband was away at war. Alcmene never knew she had been deceived, and from this union she became pregnant with a child destined for greatness. But Hera had been watching, and she was done being humiliated by Zeus's affairs. When she learned that Zeus planned to make this child the greatest hero and king of all Greece, she interfered in the most devastating way possible. Zeus had sworn that the next child born in the line of Perseus would rule over all of Mycenae. He meant this to be Heracles, but Hera used her divine powers to delay Heracles' birth while speeding up the birth of another Perseus descendant, a weak, cowardly child named Eurystheus, who was born just hours before Heracles. Zeus was furious when he realized what had happened, but even the king of the gods couldn't break an oath sworn before the entire pantheon. Eurystheus, not Heracles, would be the king, and Heracles would be subject to him. But Zeus got his revenge in a typically sneaky way. He brought the infant Heracles to Mount Olympus while Hera was sleeping and placed him at her breast to nurse. Hera's divine milk gave the baby incredible strength and partial immortality. When she woke up and realized what was happening, she pushed the child away violently, and her milk sprayed across the heavens, creating the Milky Way. Hera's humiliation demanded vengeance. That night, she sent 2 enormous serpents to strangle the baby in his crib. But when the snakes wrapped around tiny Heracles, he just giggled and grabbed one in each hand, strangling them both as if they were toys. This established the pattern that would define Heracles' entire life. He had incredible strength and generally good intentions, but his explosive temper would lead to tragedy after tragedy. When Heracles grew up and married Megara, princess of Thebes, it seemed like he had found happiness at last. They had 3 beautiful children, and he was in line to become king. But Hera had been waiting for this moment. She wanted to destroy Heracles when his fall would cause maximum pain. She cast a spell of madness over him, making him see monsters attacking his family instead of his wife and children. In his delirium, Heracles fought these creatures with all his strength, using his bare hands to tear them apart. Only when the madness lifted did he realize the horrific truth. He had murdered his own family. The guilt nearly drove him to suicide. In ancient Greece, killing family members was the ultimate crime, one that would bring the curse of the Furies, unless he found a way to atone. The oracle at Delphi gave him the answer, but it was devastating. He must serve his cowardly cousin Eurystheus for 12 years, completing whatever tasks the king set for him, no matter how dangerous or humiliating. This was the beginning of the 12 labors of Heracles, challenges so impossible they were designed to kill him. The first labor was to slay the Nemean lion, a monster with hide so thick that no weapon could penetrate it. Its claws could cut through any armor, and its roar could drive men insane. Heracles tracked it to its cave and fought it with his bare hands, strangling the beast just as he had strangled Hera's serpents as a baby. Using the lion's own claws to cut through its hide, he skinned the creature and wore its pelt as armor. From then on, he was nearly invulnerable, protected by the lion's magical hide. The second labor was even more challenging. The Lernaean Hydra was a water serpent with 9 heads, and whenever one was cut off, 2 would grow back. Worse, Hera sent a giant crab to attack Heracles while he fought the monster. But his nephew Aeolus came to help, cauterizing each neck with a burning torch as Heracles cut off the heads, preventing new ones from growing. Together, they defeated the seemingly invincible monster. But when Heracles returned to report his success, King Eurystheus declared that this labor didn't count because he had received help. The hero would need to complete an additional 13th labor. Even when Heracles succeeded brilliantly, there was always some technicality that turned his victories into failures. This pattern would repeat throughout his labors, showing how the gods and mortals seemed determined to keep him struggling, no matter how great his achievements. The third labor sent him to capture the Cyrenian hind, a deer with golden antlers that was sacred to Artemis. The challenge was catching it alive without harming it. For an entire year, Heracles chased the incredibly fast creature across all of Greece before finally managing to capture it. The fourth labor was to bring back the Erymanthian boar alive. This seemed straightforward after the previous challenges, but Heracles learned that even simple missions could become complicated. On his way to the boar, he stopped to visit his old friend Pholus, a civilized centaur. During their meal, they opened a jar of wine that belonged to all the centaurs. The aroma attracted dozens of wild centaurs, who attacked when they saw that a human had been drinking their wine. Heracles fought them off with his poisoned arrows, but in the chaos, one arrow went wide and struck Chiron, his old teacher. Another accident killed his friend Pholus. Even his victories came at a terrible cost to those around him. The fifth labor seemed almost insulting. Clean the Augean stables in a single day. These stables housed 3,000 cattle and hadn't been cleaned in 30 years. But Heracles proved that brains could triumph where brawn alone would fail. Instead of shoveling manure by hand, he diverted 2 rivers to wash away the accumulated filth in just a few hours. When he went to collect his payment from King Augeas, the king refused to honor their agreement. And when he returned to Eurystheus, the cowardly king also refused to count this labor, claiming that since Heracles had been promised payment, it wasn't a true labor of penance. The sixth labor sent him to drive away the Stymphalian birds, man-eating creatures with bronze beaks and metallic feathers they could launch like arrows. Using a bronze rattle given to him by Athena, Heracles made such a terrible noise that the birds rose into the air in a massive flock. Then he shot them down with his poisoned arrows, his archery skills proving as deadly as his strength. For the seventh labor, Heracles traveled to Crete to capture the mad bull that had once been sacred to Poseidon. This was the same bull that had fathered the Minotaur, and it had been rampaging across the island ever since. Heracles wrestled it into submission and rode it across the sea back to Greece, since it was a child of Poseidon and could walk on water. The eighth labor took him to Thrace to capture the man-eating mares of King Diomedes. These horses had been fed on human flesh for so long that they had become monsters. When Heracles arrived with his young companion Abderus, the boy was fascinated by the terrible beauty of the creatures. While Heracles went to confront the king, Abderus moved too close to the horses, and they tore him apart. In his grief and rage, Heracles fed King Diomedes to his own horses. Ironically, the king's flesh was so vile that it cured the horses of their taste for human meat, and they became docile. The ninth labor was perhaps the most morally complex. Heracles was sent to obtain the girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. When he arrived with his band of warriors, the Amazons welcomed them with surprising hospitality. Queen Hippolyta was so impressed by Heracles' reputation that she was willing to give him her girdle freely. But Hera couldn't allow such an easy success. Disguising herself as an Amazon, she spread rumors that the Greeks had come to kidnap their queen. The Amazons attacked, and in the confusion, Heracles killed Hippolyta, thinking she had betrayed him. Another innocent person died because of the gods' petty interference. The 10th labor sent Heracles to the very edge of the world to steal the cattle of Geryon, a three-bodied giant. The journey was so difficult that Heracles actually shot an arrow at the sun itself, threatening to kill Helios if the heat didn't let up. The sun god, impressed by such audacity, lent Heracles his golden cup for the voyage. The 11th labor was the most challenging yet. Retrieve the golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides. These apples granted immortality and were guarded by a 100-headed dragon. The problem was that no mortal could pick them from the tree. Heracles' solution involved Atlas, the titan condemned to hold up the sky. He offered to take Atlas's burden temporarily if the titan would retrieve the apples. Atlas agreed, grateful for even a brief rest. The weight of the heavens was unimaginable agony for Heracles, but he endured it.
When Atlas returned with the apples, he didn't want to take the sky back. He offered to deliver the apples himself and leave Heracles holding the heavens forever. But Heracles was too clever to be trapped. He asked Atlas to take the sky back for just a moment so he could adjust his cloak for padding. The instant Atlas took back the burden, Heracles grabbed the apples and fled. The 12th and final labor was the most dangerous. Bring back Cerberus, the three-headed dog that guarded the gates of the underworld. This required Heracles to enter the realm of the dead and return, something no living person had ever done. After being initiated into sacred mysteries that prepared souls for death, Heracles descended to the underworld. He found Hades sitting on his throne, and politely asked permission to borrow Cerberus. The god of the dead was amused and agreed, but with strict conditions. Heracles must subdue the monster without weapons and return it unharmed. The battle between hero and hellhound was titanic. Cerberus's three heads snapped at him, while its serpentine tail lashed around his legs. But gradually, Heracles' divine strength prevailed. He choked the monster unconscious and carried it to the surface. When he presented Cerberus to King Eurystheus, the coward hid in his bronze jar and begged Heracles to take the creature away immediately. With all 12 labors complete, Heracles was finally free from his servitude. The curse of murdering his family lifted through his suffering and achievement. But freedom brought new challenges. What was a hero to do when his greatest trials were behind him? Heracles would go on to have many more adventures, but his final tragedy came through love. He married Deianira, who truly cared for him. But when a centaur named Nessus tried to rape her, Heracles shot him with a hydra-poisoned arrow. As he died, Nessus gave Deianira some of his blood, claiming it was a love potion that would keep Heracles faithful. Years later, when Heracles took another lover, Deianira smeared the centaur's blood on a robe and sent it to her husband. The moment he put it on, the hydra's poison began burning his flesh. The robe stuck to his skin and couldn't be removed. The pain was so agonizing that Heracles built a funeral pyre and threw himself into the flames. But as his mortal body burned, Zeus rescued his son's spirit and brought him to Olympus. Heracles became a god, finally achieving the immortality he had long deserved. Even Hera forgave him, and he married Hebe, the goddess of youth. While Heracles was completing his labors, another kind of hero was emerging. Jason should have been a king, but his uncle Pelias had murdered his father and stolen the throne. Raised by the wise centaur Chiron, Jason grew up learning not just fighting skills, but diplomacy and leadership. When he returned to reclaim his birthright, Jason arrived wearing only one sandal, having lost the other while helping an old woman cross a river. That woman had been Hera in disguise, and she was so impressed by his kindness that she decided to help him. But her aid would come at a terrible price. King Pelias had been warned by an oracle to beware a man with one sandal. Seeing Jason, he knew this was the prophesied threat. But instead of killing him outright, Pelias devised what he thought was an impossible challenge: retrieve the golden fleece from Colchis. The golden fleece came from the ram that had rescued two royal children from their murderous stepmother. The ram had carried them to safety in Colchis, where it was sacrificed and its golden fleece hung in a grove sacred to Ares, guarded by a dragon that never slept. Jason accepted the challenge and gathered the greatest heroes of the age. Heracles joined the expedition, along with Orpheus, the legendary musician, Atalanta, the huntress,
and dozens of other famous warriors. They sailed in the Argo, the most advanced ship ever built, constructed by Argus with Athena's guidance. The voyage to Colchis was filled with adventures that tested every skill the Argonauts possessed. They stopped at the island of Lemnos, inhabited entirely by women who had murdered every man on the island.
These women tried to seduce and then kill the heroes, but Aphrodite intervened, making them genuinely fall in love instead. The Argonauts stayed on Lemnos for nearly a year, living in luxury and pleasure, until Heracles shamed them into remembering their quest. They sailed on through the clashing rocks, massive stone formations that crushed ships trying to pass between them. Following advice from a seer, they released a dove to test the passage, then rowed frantically through as the rocks separated. When they finally reached Colchis, King Aeetes had no intention of giving up the Golden Fleece.
He set Jason 3 impossible tasks: yoke fire-breathing bulls, sow a field with dragon's teeth, and defeat the army of warriors that would spring from the ground. Jason despaired, until he received help from an unexpected source. Medea, the king's daughter and a powerful sorceress, had fallen in love with him through Hera's intervention. Using her magic, she gave Jason protection from fire and weapons for 1 day. With this aid, Jason completed the tasks, yoking the fire-breathing bulls and defeating the Earthborn warriors. But King Aeetes planned to kill the Argonauts that night anyway. Medea warned Jason and led him to the grove where the Golden Fleece hung under the dragon's watchful eyes. Using a magical lullaby, Medea put the sleepless dragon to sleep. Jason climbed the tree and retrieved the fleece, which blazed with divine light. Then they fled to their ship, with Medea joining them. As the Colchian fleet pursued them, Medea committed an act so horrific, it shocked even the hardened Argonauts. She had brought her young brother Absyrtus with her, and now she murdered him on the deck of the ship. Then she dismembered his body and threw the pieces into the sea, one by one. King Aeetes, seeing his son's remains floating in the water, was forced to stop the pursuit to gather them for proper burial. By the time this grim task was complete, the Argo had escaped. The journey home was as dangerous as the voyage out. They encountered the Sirens, but Orpheus saved them by playing his lyre so beautifully that it drowned out the deadly song. They passed Scylla and Charybdis, the monster and whirlpool that had nearly destroyed Odysseus. When they finally reached Greece, Jason presented the Golden Fleece to Peleus, expecting to receive his throne. But the king refused to honor their agreement. This was a fatal mistake. Medea, furious at the betrayal, approached Peleus's daughters and demonstrated her magic by cutting up an old ram, boiling it in a cauldron, and restoring it to youth. Convinced that Medea could restore their aging father in the same way, the daughters murdered Peleus and boiled his body. But Medea simply walked away, leaving them to realize they had killed their own father for nothing. Jason finally had his throne, but his triumph was hollow. The people, horrified by the king's murder, drove both Jason and Medea into exile. They settled in Corinth, where they lived peacefully for a while and had 2 children. But Jason's ambition wasn't satisfied by domestic peace. When the king of Corinth offered him his daughter's hand in marriage, Jason divorced Medea to advance his position. This was the worst decision of his life. Medea's love, when betrayed, turned to a hatred as powerful as her magic. She sent the princess a poisoned robe that burst into flames when worn, killing both the girl and her father. But Medea's revenge wasn't complete. To cause Jason maximum pain, she murdered their 2 children with her own hands, then escaped in a chariot drawn by dragons. Jason lived the rest of his life as a broken man, never finding peace. In the end, he died when a rotting beam from the old Argo fell on him as he sat beneath it, remembering his days of glory. The quest for the Golden Fleece had succeeded beyond anyone's dreams, but like so many Greek stories, success and tragedy were inseparably linked. Jason had proved that even the impossible could be achieved, but he learned that some victories come at too high a price. While Jason was building his legend through exploration,
another hero was emerging as the champion of civilization itself. Theseus would transform Athens from a minor city-state into the cultural center of Greece. But his story began with mystery and prophecy. King Aegeus of Athens had tried many times to father an heir, but had failed. Desperate for a son, he consulted the oracle at Delphi, receiving a cryptic prophecy about not opening wine until he reached Athens's height. Confused, he traveled to Troezen to consult with King Pythias, known for interpreting difficult prophecies. Pythias understood immediately and arranged for his daughter Aethra to sleep with Aegeus. But that same night, Poseidon also visited Aethra, drawn by her beauty and virtue. The child that was conceived had two fathers, one mortal and one divine, giving Theseus both human wisdom and supernatural strength. Before leaving, Aegeus hid his sword and sandals under a massive boulder, telling Aethra that when their son was strong enough to lift the rock, he should take these tokens and come to Athens to claim his birthright. Theseus grew up in Troezen, displaying remarkable strength from an early age, but his most notable trait was his sense of justice. He couldn't stand to see the weak oppressed or the innocent harmed. When Theseus reached manhood and easily lifted his father's boulder, he chose to travel to Athens by the dangerous land route instead of the safe sea voyage. This wasn't recklessness, but a deliberate choice to clean up the lawless road between Troezen and Athens. The first challenge came at Epidaurus, where the bandit Periphetes terrorized travelers with his bronze club. But Theseus used intelligence as well as strength, dodging the bandit's charge and turning his own weapon against him. At Corinth, he faced Sinis, the pine bender, who tied victims between two bent pine trees and released them, tearing people apart. Theseus used the bandit's own method against him, delivering poetic justice. At the Skyronian rocks, the bandit Skyron would ask travelers to wash his feet, then kick them off the cliff to feed a giant turtle. Theseus caught the bandit's foot and hurled Skyron into the sea instead. At Eleusis, he defeated Cercion, the king who forced visitors to wrestle to the death, using superior technique to overcome the wrestling master's brutal strength. Finally, at Erineus, he encountered Procrustes, who offered travelers a bed that would fit anyone perfectly. If guests were too short, he stretched them on a rack. If too long, he cut off their legs or head. Theseus put Procrustes on his own bed and cut off his head, explaining that the bandit was too long for it. By the time Theseus reached Athens, his reputation had spread throughout Greece. King Aegeus welcomed him without revealing their relationship, wanting to observe his character first. But Athens had a terrible problem. For years, the city had been paying tribute to King Minos of Crete. After losing a war, Athens had to send 7 young men and 7 young women every 7 years to be fed to the Minotaur, a monster with a man's body and bull's head that lived in an impossible labyrinth. When the time came for the 3rd tribute, Theseus volunteered to be one of the 7 young men. Aegeus begged him not to go, finally revealing their relationship. But Theseus was determined to end this horror. He promised that if he succeeded, he would change his ship's black sails to white on the return journey. When the Athenian ship reached Crete, Theseus caught the attention of Ariadne, King Minos' daughter. Horrified by the yearly sacrifice to her monstrous half-brother, she offered to help Theseus navigate the labyrinth if he would take her back to Athens as his wife. The labyrinth had been designed by Daedalus to be impossible to escape. Ariadne's solution was elegantly simple: a ball of thread. Theseus could tie one end at the entrance and follow it back after facing the Minotaur. The fight at the heart of the labyrinth was desperate. The Minotaur was huge, with massive muscles and deadly horns. But Theseus combined speed and intelligence, using the narrow corridors to limit the monster's charges until he could grab its horns and break its neck. Following the thread back, Theseus emerged with the other Athenian youths and escaped Crete with Ariadne. But on the voyage home, he made a dishonorable decision that revealed a flaw in his character. During a stop at Naxos, he abandoned Ariadne while she slept, sailing away without her. Worse, in his excitement about returning home in triumph, Theseus forgot to change his sails from black to white.
King Aegeus, watching from a cliff, saw the black sails and assumed his son was dead. In his grief, the king threw himself into the sea, which has been called the Aegean ever since. So, Theseus's greatest victory was also a terrible tragedy. He had freed Athens from the Minotaur's terror, but his carelessness had killed his father. He became king under the shadow of this guilt. As king, Theseus proved to be a visionary leader. He united scattered villages into a single political entity, established laws protecting common citizens, and created institutions that would evolve into democracy. But his personal life remained troubled by arrogance and poor judgment that would eventually lead to his downfall. All these heroic stories were building towards something unprecedented. The gods had grown tired of the proliferation of heroes and demigods on Earth. Zeus decided it was time to separate the realms of gods and mortals once and for all. He would orchestrate the greatest war in history, one that would consume most of the remaining heroes in a single, catastrophic conflict. The war began with a wedding that excluded one crucial guest. When the sea goddess Thetis married the mortal king Peleus, all the gods were invited except Eris, goddess of discord and strife. Furious at being snubbed, Eris decided to prove why she was necessary by crafting a golden apple inscribed with "To the Fairest" and rolling it into the wedding feast. 3 goddesses immediately claimed the apple: Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. The argument grew so heated it threatened to tear Olympus apart. Zeus, wisely refusing to choose between his wife, daughter, and great niece, declared that a mortal must judge. He chose Paris, a prince of Troy known for fair judgment and understanding of beauty. What Zeus didn't mention was that Paris had an interesting history. Before his birth, his mother Hecuba had dreamed she gave birth to a flaming torch that set Troy on fire. Interpreting this as meaning the child would destroy the city, King Priam had ordered the baby exposed on a mountain. But the servant couldn't kill an innocent child and gave Paris to a shepherd, who raised him unaware of his true heritage. When Hermes brought the 3 goddesses to him for judgment, Paris had no idea he was about to trigger the greatest war in history. Each goddess offered a bribe. Hera promised power over vast territories. Athena offered to make him the greatest warrior who ever lived. But Aphrodite's offer was more appealing to the romantic young man: the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris awarded the apple to Aphrodite, making lifelong enemies of Hera and Athena. Aphrodite kept her promise, but the most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, queen of Sparta and wife of King Menelaus. She was already married and living in a foreign country, surrounded by guards. But Aphrodite arranged for Paris to be recognized by his true parents and sent to Sparta as an ambassador. When Paris and Helen looked at each other, the goddess's magic took effect. They fell in love with an intensity that overwhelmed all other considerations, and eloped to Troy with a ship full of Spartan treasure. The elopement sent shockwaves throughout Greece. Helen wasn't just any woman, but the daughter of Zeus, connected to most royal families. More importantly, when she had been old enough to marry, every eligible king and prince had sought her hand. To prevent civil war, Odysseus had made all her suitors swear to defend whoever she chose. They had agreed because each thought he would be chosen. But now the oath bound them to support Menelaus's claim to his wife. Agamemnon, Menelaus's brother and the most powerful king in Greece, took charge of organizing the war effort. One by one, he called in the oaths, assembling the greatest army in history. Some heroes tried to avoid their obligations. Odysseus pretended to be insane, plowing his fields with salt. But when recruiters placed his infant son in front of the plow, he swerved to avoid harm, proving his sanity. Achilles' mother Thetis, knowing from prophecy that her son would either live long in obscurity or die young with eternal glory at Troy, disguised him as a girl. But Odysseus tracked him down by placing weapons among feminine gifts, and Achilles immediately revealed himself by choosing the sword and shield. Confronted with the choice between safety and glory, Achilles chose fame over long life, joining the expedition with his devoted companion Patroclus. The assembled army was staggering, 1,000 ships carrying over 50,000 warriors. But when they tried to sail from Aulis, the winds died completely. The prophet Calchas revealed that Agamemnon had offended Artemis by boasting he was a better hunter than the goddess. To appease Artemis and restore the winds, Agamemnon would have to sacrifice his eldest daughter Iphigenia. Torn between love for his child and duty to the army, ambition won. He lured his wife and daughter to Aulis with a false promise of marriage to Achilles, then sacrificed the girl while she was still in her wedding dress. The winds returned and the fleet sailed for Troy. But Clytemnestra never forgave her husband for murdering their child, and spent the next 10 years planning revenge. When the Greeks reached Troy, they found a city prepared for siege. Troy had walls so high they seemed to touch the sky, built by Poseidon and Apollo themselves. The city was wealthy and well defended, with divine protection from several gods. The war settled into a brutal stalemate. For 9 years, neither side could achieve decisive victory.
The Greeks couldn't break Troy's walls, and the Trojans couldn't drive them from the beaches. Both sides produced legendary heroes. For the Greeks, Achilles was unmatched in combat, swift and terrible. Ajax was a defensive specialist with a shield that could protect multiple warriors. Diomedes was so fierce, he actually wounded gods who intervened in battle. For the Trojans, Hector was the perfect hero. Brave, honorable, devoted to family and city. Unlike warriors who fought for personal glory, Hector fought to protect innocent people. He was Troy's greatest defender, and the only warrior who could match Achilles. The war's turning point came in its 10th year through a personal quarrel. Agamemnon had taken a priest's daughter as his concubine. When the priest offered ransom, Agamemnon not only refused, but insulted him publicly. Apollo sent a plague that swept through the Greek camp, killing hundreds. Achilles demanded that Agamemnon return the girl to appease the god.
Agamemnon agreed, but demanded compensation. Briseis, a captive awarded to Achilles. This sparked a confrontation that nearly destroyed the Greek cause. Achilles was furious at being forced to give up his prize to compensate for Agamemnon's stupidity. He accused the king of cowardice and greed. Agamemnon responded by asserting his authority, taking Briseis whether Achilles liked it or not. Achilles reached for his sword, ready to kill Agamemnon, but Athena restrained him and promised threefold compensation if he held his temper. Instead of violence, Achilles chose a more devastating response: withdrawal. He and his warriors would no longer fight for the Greeks. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Without Achilles, Greek morale collapsed, while Trojan confidence soared. Hector led aggressive attacks that drove the Greeks back toward their ships for the first time in the war. Desperate to save the army, Patroclus, Achilles' closest friend and possibly lover, borrowed Achilles' armor and led the Myrmidons into battle. The sight of what appeared to be Achilles returning restored Greek morale and terrified the Trojans. But Patroclus was young and caught up in battle's excitement. When the Trojans fled, he pursued them beyond his orders, driven by dreams of glory. He might have taken Troy itself, but Apollo intervened, stunning Patroclus and stripping away his protection. In his confusion, he was struck by a Trojan spear and finished off by Hector. When news reached Achilles, his grief transformed into rage so pure and terrible it frightened the gods. Thetis brought him new armor, forged by Hephaestus, including a shield that depicted the entire world. Armed with divine weapons and consumed by fury, Achilles returned to battle like a force of nature. He killed so many Trojans that the river became choked with bodies. The climactic confrontation came when he challenged Hector outside Troy's walls. Hector knew he was no match for Achilles in this state, but as Troy's defender, he couldn't refuse without losing honor. The fight was brief and decisive. Achilles' divine armor protected him, while his spear found the one vulnerable spot in Hector's gear. But Achilles' revenge didn't end with death. In his rage, he tied Hector's body to his chariot and dragged it around Troy's walls, while the family watched in horror. For days, he abused the corpse, denying proper burial rites. Finally, King Priam came to the Greek camp at night, guided by Hermes. The old king knelt before Achilles and begged for his son's body, appealing to the hero's understanding of grief. Achilles, seeing in Priam's sorrow a reflection of his own pain, finally relented and returned Hector's body. But Achilles' doom was approaching.
Paris, guided by Apollo, shot him with an arrow that struck his one vulnerable spot, his heel, where his mother had held him when dipping him in the river Styx. The death of Achilles nearly broke Greek morale, but it also freed them from the stalemate his conflicts had created. Under Odysseus' leadership, they devised the famous Trojan horse, a masterpiece of deception. The idea was elegant: build a giant wooden horse, hide warriors inside, and present it as a peace offering. Epius constructed the horse with Athena's guidance, large enough to hold 30 warriors. Meanwhile, the army prepared an elaborate deception. On the appointed day, the Trojans found the Greek camp empty and the fleet gone. Only the wooden horse remained. With the horse was Sinon, a Greek who pretended to be a deserter. Under torture, he spun a lie about the horse being an offering to Athena, built too large to prevent the Trojans from taking it into their city. This reverse psychology worked perfectly. Convinced they were stealing something valuable, the Trojans brought the horse inside Troy's walls, celebrating victory and the war's end. Only Cassandra urged caution, warning that the horse was full of Greek warriors. But her people dismissed her warnings as mad ravings, just as Apollo's curse intended. That night, while Troy celebrated, the Greek warriors emerged and opened the city gates to their army, which had returned under darkness. Troy fell in a single night of fire and slaughter. The sack was brutal beyond description. Priam was murdered at an altar. Hector's infant son was thrown from the walls to prevent future revenge. Trojan women were divided as slaves among the victors. But the Greeks' victory was hollow. They had won through treachery rather than honest combat, and their brutal treatment of the defeated offended even their divine allies. The gods began planning punishments that would make their homecomings as difficult as the war itself. Agamemnon would return only to be murdered by Clytemnestra, who had never forgiven him for sacrificing their daughter. Menelaus would wander for years before reaching Sparta. Most famously, Odysseus would spend 10 years trying to reach Ithaca, facing monsters and sorceresses that tested his cleverness more than any battle. The Trojan War marked the end of the Age of Heroes. So many great bloodlines had ended at Troy that few demigods remained. The gods, satisfied they had separated themselves from mortals, retreated to Olympus and left humanity to find its own way. But the stories would live forever, inspiring artists for thousands of years. They captured something essential about human nature: our capacity for both greatness and folly, our ability to achieve the impossible while destroying ourselves. The war that began with a goddess's spite and a prince's choice had consumed the greatest heroes of an age. Its end brought not peace, but recognition, that some prices are too high, some victories too costly to celebrate. From Troy's ashes would eventually rise new civilizations, new heroes, new stories. But none would match the epic scope and tragic grandeur of the war that ended the age when gods and humans shared the world. These ancient stories are still told because they reveal eternal truths about power, love, heroism, and the price of greatness. Every hero's journey in modern movies echoes these patterns. Every tale of love conquering all, every story of the underdog facing impossible odds, draws from these Greek templates. When you watch Star Wars, you're seeing Perseus's quest. When you read about tragic heroes brought down by their flaws, you're encountering ideas first explored with Achilles and Oedipus. These myths gave us words we still use: narcissistic, titanic, Herculean, Odyssey, Trojan horse. They provided foundations for literature, philosophy, and psychology. Most importantly, they remind us that the greatest stories reveal truth about human nature. The Greeks understood that heroes aren't perfect, but flawed individuals who choose to strive for greatness despite knowing the cost. They knew gods aren't moral exemplars, but powerful forces that must be respected and sometimes defied.
If this complete journey through Greek mythology has captivated you as much as it captivated audiences for 3 millennia, then you understand why these tales never truly die. Hit that subscribe button to join us for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. Let us know in the comments which myth resonated most with you, or which hero's journey you'd like to explore in greater detail. Remember, these ancient stories are still being told because they still teach us. In a world that often seems as chaotic as the primordial void from which everything emerged, we can find inspiration in heroes who faced impossible odds and chose to fight anyway, who suffered terrible losses but never gave up hope, who understood that real victory isn't avoiding tragedy, but facing it with courage and grace. Until our next mythological adventure, may your own story be worthy of the ancient bards who kept these legends alive for 3,000 years.